Lucas Stanley had always believed that moving out of the city was the right decision. He had spent most of his adult life in a fast-paced, chaotic environment where the sound of honking horns and distant sirens had become background noise. The thought of trading all of that for quiet roads, open space, and a community where people actually acknowledged each other seemed like an upgrade, a much-needed escape from the grind. So when he found a house in what appeared to be an idyllic suburban neighborhood, he thought he had finally struck gold. The place was quiet, well-maintained, and at least on the surface, appeared to be exactly what he had been looking for. The houses were spaced out enough to offer privacy, but close enough to make the area feel like a community. Manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, and a general air of calmness gave it a picture-perfect aesthetic that felt almost unreal. At first glance, it was everything he wanted until he met Karen Henderson. The first time he saw her, she was standing at the edge of her property, watering an already overhydrated flower with the kind of exaggerated care that suggested it was more for show than necessity. She was an older woman, maybe in her mid-50s, with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Lucas had barely stepped out of his truck, still stretching after the long drive from his old apartment, when she looked up from her perfectly arranged garden and gave him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the kind of expression that felt rehearsed, polite but void of any real warmth, as if she were merely performing the pleasantries expected of a good neighbor. "You're the new one," she said, not in the form of a question but more like a statement of fact. Lucas nodded, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness. "Yeah, just moved in today. Lucas Stanley." Karen tilted her head slightly, still gripping the garden hose, her knuckles whitening around the plastic. "Well, welcome. We like to keep things peaceful around here. I'm sure you'll fit right in if you understand how things work." Something about the way she said it made Lucas pause. It wasn't the words themselves, but the tone firm, slightly condescending, like she wasn't just greeting him but subtly warning him. He brushed it off as nothing more than a small-town eccentricity. Every neighborhood had one self-appointed overseer who made sure everything ran according to their personal standards. "Sounds good," he replied, offering a nod before heading back to the truck to start unloading his things. He barely gave the conversation a second thought until later that evening when he took his car out for a short drive to grab some last-minute essentials. It was a Sunday, and the streets were nearly empty. The sky had dimmed to a muted orange, the last remnants of daylight stretching lazily across the horizon as he cruised down the perfectly paved roads. The drive was peaceful, exactly the kind of thing he had imagined when he thought about living in a quieter area. He returned about 30 minutes later, parked his car, and was about to head inside when he noticed something peculiar. Karen was still outside, standing near her porch, watching him with a scrutinizing look. "You went out," she observed, her voice carrying effortlessly across the yard. Lucas furrowed his brow, confused by the odd remark. Yeah, just grabbed a few things from the store." There was a slight pause, just long enough to make the air feel heavier than it should have. Karen took a step closer, crossing the invisible line between friendly concern and something more intrusive. "We don't usually drive on Sundays," she said, as if that explained anything. Lucas let out a small, incredulous chuckle, expecting her to break into a grin and admit she was joking, but her expression remained unwaveringly serious. "You don't drive on Sundays?" he repeated, just to make sure he hadn't misheard. She nodded. "It's a tradition in this neighborhood. A day of rest, silence. No unnecessary movement, no disturbances. It keeps the balance." Lucas had encountered some strange community rules before: limits on the color of mailboxes, grass height regulations, even fines for leaving trash bins out too long, but the idea that a group of people had collectively decided not to drive on a specific day of the week was downright bizarre. He wanted to question it, ask how such a thing even started, but the way Karen looked at him made him hesitate. It was the same look a strict schoolteacher might give an unruly student expecting obedience, not negotiation. "Well," he said, trying to keep his tone light, "I guess I'll have to get used to things around here." Karen's lips twitched into something that resembled a smile, but her eyes still held that unsettling sharpness. "I'm sure you will." She turned and walked back to her house without another word, leaving Lucas standing there, an inexplicable chill creeping up his spine. He shook it off, convincing himself he was overthinking things. Every small town had their quirks, their odd little traditions. It was probably nothing. But then, the next morning, he found something that made his stomach turn, a single rusty nail, placed deliberately just behind his rear tire. At first, he thought it was an accident, maybe something left behind by a construction worker or a careless passerby. But as he picked it up and examined it, a feeling of unease settled in his gut. It wasn't just dropped carelessly on the pavement. It was positioned perfectly, placed in such a way that if he had backed out without noticing, his tire would have been punctured immediately. Lucas straightened up, his eyes drifting towards Karen's house. Her curtains twitched slightly, a barely noticeable movement, but enough to confirm that she was watching. He didn't react, didn't acknowledge what he had seen. Instead, he tucked the nail into his pocket and went about his morning as if nothing had happened. If this was some kind of test, some passive-aggressive way of seeing whether he would fall in line, he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But in the back of his mind, one thought gnawed at him. This wasn't just about some weird community rule. Karen wasn't just an overzealous neighbor with a fixation on peace and quiet. This was something else entirely. And whatever it was, he had just unknowingly stepped right into the middle of it. Lucas hadn't planned on making enemies within his first week of living in the neighborhood, but the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest since meeting Karen refused to go away. He told himself it was just small-town eccentricity, a harmless, outdated tradition that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. He wasn't about to let one strange conversation dictate how he lived his life, nor was he going to be bullied into following rules that made no logical sense. Yet, as the week progressed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he stepped outside, whether to grab the mail, water the few plants he had in his front yard, or simply enjoy the cool evening air, he felt eyes on him. He tried to ignore it, telling himself that adjusting to a new place always came with an adjustment period. By the time the next Sunday rolled around, he had mostly convinced himself that the nail he had found behind his tire was just a coincidence. A fluke. There was no way an entire neighborhood was so committed to something so ridiculous that they would actively sabotage someone's vehicle just to make a point. People had better things to do. Lucas had better things to do. So, as usual, he started his day without a second thought about what day of the week it was. He drank his coffee, stretched, and went through his usual routine. It wasn't until he stepped outside and saw how eerily still the neighborhood was that he hesitated for a moment. Every driveway was full, every car parked neatly in place as if no one had left their house since the night before. Curtains were drawn, porches empty, not a single sign of movement from any of the neighbors. Lucas had seen quiet Sundays before, but this wasn't normal. This was absolute silence, a forced stillness that felt unnatural, like the entire block had been frozen in time. For a brief second, he considered staying home, but the thought annoyed him. He had lived in far worse places, dealt with far worse people. He wasn't about to be intimidated by an old woman with a superiority complex and a strange obsession with controlling her surroundings. He got in his car, started the engine, and pulled out of his driveway, the only sound in the entire neighborhood being the low rumble of his tires rolling over the pavement. He didn't speed, didn't rev the engine obnoxiously or do anything that might have been perceived as intentionally disruptive, yet as he drove past Karen's house, he saw her standing on her porch, staring at him. She wasn't alone. Several other neighbors had appeared, some peeking out from their windows, others standing just far enough outside their doors to make it clear that they were watching, but not enough to be considered confrontational. They weren't trying to stop him, weren't actively engaging with him, yet their silent observation felt more unsettling than if they had. Lucas kept his focus on the road, refusing to acknowledge them. The further he drove, the more ridiculous the situation seemed. It was just a drive to the store. There was no law against driving on a Sunday, no real reason why it should be an issue, and yet the way they had looked at him as he left felt like some unspoken warning. By the time he reached the store, he had managed to shake off the tension, rolling his shoulders and forcing himself to breathe normally again. It was just the discomfort of being new, of standing out in a place where everyone already knew each other. He went inside, grabbed what he needed, and took his time walking through the aisles, trying to distract himself from the lingering unease that clung to him. It was only on the way back that things took a turn. He was about 3 blocks from his house when he heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of a gunshot. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that it took his brain a second to register what had just happened. His body reacted before his mind could fully process it, his hands gripping the wheel tighter, his foot easing off the gas as adrenaline surged through him. The car veered slightly, and almost immediately, he felt the telltale shift in weight that signaled a flat tire. His heart pounded as he forced himself to remain calm. He didn't slam on the brakes or make any sudden movements. Instead, he eased the car to the side of the road, checking his mirrors instinctively. The street behind him was empty, no visible movement, no sign of where the shot had come from. He sat there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. The smart thing would be to call the police, but he hesitated. He didn't know this place well enough yet. If the neighbors were really as insistent on their traditions as they seemed to be, who was to say the police wouldn't be the same way? A part of him wanted to believe that it wasn't an actual gunshot, that maybe it had just been a loud noise, something he had mistaken for a shot because of his own paranoia. But when he stepped out of the car and crouched down to inspect the damage, his stomach dropped. There was a clean hole in the rubber, a small but precise puncture that was unmistakably caused by a bullet. He exhaled slowly, forcing his pulse to steady itself. Someone had just shot his tire. He straightened, his eyes scanning the street. Houses stood silent on either side, driveways full, windows still drawn shut. If there was someone out here, they weren't making themselves known. He turned his head slowly, taking in every possible vantage point. There were too many places someone could have fired from behind a fence, from a second-story window, through the barely parted curtains of any one of these homes. He was out in the open, exposed. He needed to move. Lucas forced himself to walk back to the car at a normal pace, resisting the urge to sprint, to duck, to do anything that might make it obvious he was panicking. Once inside, he locked the doors and immediately dialed 911. The operator picked up almost instantly, her voice calm and detached. 911, what's your emergency? Lucas took a breath, keeping his voice steady. I'm in Fairview Drive, just off Oak Ridge. Someone just shot my tire while I was driving. There was a brief pause, just long enough to make something inside him twist. Sir, did you see who fired the shot? No, but there's a bullet hole in my tire. It happened while I was driving back home. I heard the shot, pulled over and saw the damage. Another pause. Are you injured? No. Do you feel unsafe? Lucas hesitated. Did he? Yes. But something about the way she asked the question, the slight indifference in her tone, made him uneasy. I don't know, he admitted. We'll send an officer to check it out, she said, and though her voice was professional, it lacked urgency. Stay where you are. Lucas hung up, his grip on the phone tightening. There was something about the way she had spoken, the pause before confirming they'd send someone, that made him feel like he had just made a mistake. As he sat there in his car, staring at the empty street, a realization crept into his mind like a slow-moving shadow. Whoever had done this wasn't worried about being caught. And that meant they thought no one was going to stop them. Lucas sat in his car, staring at the empty street, his pulse still thrumming from the realization that someone had just shot at him. The silence that followed was almost more unsettling than the gunshot itself. It wasn't the kind of chaotic aftermath he would have expected if this had been some random act of violence. No neighbors rushing out to see what had happened, no hushed voices murmuring behind windows, no dogs barking in reaction to the loud noise. It was as if nothing had happened at all, as if the entire street had collectively decided to pretend that what had just occurred was a natural part of life here. That alone sent a fresh wave of unease creeping up his spine. He had lived in rough areas before, places where crime was common and trouble lurked in every alleyway, but even in those neighborhoods, there had been some reaction to violence, even if it was just people peering out from behind curtains or whispering about it afterward. This was different. It was intentional. His fingers flexed around the steering wheel as he glanced down at his phone, rereading the call log from his conversation with 911. The response had been slow, calculated, as if the dispatcher had needed to think carefully before deciding whether to send anyone at all. That wasn't normal. Emergency services didn't hesitate when it came to gun-related incidents, yet here he was, waiting on a patrol car that might not even show up. Maybe he was overthinking things. Maybe this was just a town with an inefficient police department, a place where officers took their time responding to calls that weren't classified as immediate life or death situations. Or maybe his gut clenched they weren't in a rush because they already knew what was happening. The thought made his skin prickle. He forced himself to take a slow breath, steadying the erratic rhythm of his heartbeat. There was no point in sitting here like a sitting duck, waiting for something else to happen. He needed to get moving, to get back to his house where he had some degree of control over his surroundings. The idea of standing out here, exposed and vulnerable, wasn't an option. He stepped out of the car and moved with deliberate calmness, refusing to show any sign of fear or urgency as he pulled open the trunk and retrieved the spare tire. Every muscle in his body was on high alert, the sensation of unseen eyes burning into the back of his skull, but he kept his expression neutral. He worked quickly, replacing the damaged tire with practiced efficiency, all the while keeping his ears trained for any sound, any shift in the unnatural stillness around him. By the time he was finished, his hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He climbed back into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine, pulling away with controlled ease. He didn't speed, didn't make any sudden movements that might suggest he was rattled. If someone was watching him, if they were gauging his reaction, he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing they had gotten under his skin. At least, not yet. As he neared his street, he spotted the familiar shape of a police cruiser idling near the curb, its emergency lights off, the officers inside making no move to get out as he pulled into his driveway. He sat for a moment, observing them from his rearview mirror. They weren't in a hurry, weren't acting with the urgency he would have expected given the circumstances. That, more than anything, set off alarm bells in his head. With a controlled exhale, he stepped out of his car and approached the patrol vehicle, noting the way the officer in the passenger seat barely glanced up from his clipboard. "You the one who called about the gunshot?" The driver asked, finally acknowledging him with a lazy flick of his gaze. Lucas nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. "Yeah, someone shot my tire while I was driving." The officer didn't react. No raised eyebrows, no follow-up questions about whether he had seen anything suspicious. He just nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting that answer. "You see anyone?" "No," Lucas said, watching him carefully. "But there was a bullet hole in my tire. I didn't imagine it." The officer hummed non-committally, flipping to a blank page on his clipboard. "You new to the neighborhood?" Lucas stiffened. That wasn't a normal question to ask during a shooting investigation. "Yeah, just moved in a few weeks ago." The officer nodded again, jotting something down, his expression unreadable. The passenger, still silent, finally looked up, his gaze scanning Lucas with something that wasn't quite suspicion but wasn't exactly neutral either. "Fairview Drive, right?" Lucas hesitated before answering. "Yeah." The officer hummed again, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "We'll look into it." That was it. No request for additional details, no offer to check nearby security footage, no mention of forensics, or even an effort to take a closer look at the damaged tire. just a vague, dismissive promise that they would look into it. Lucas felt a slow burn of frustration simmer in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Pushing too hard wouldn't get him answers, at least not the ones he needed. "Should I be concerned?" he asked, keeping his voice even. The officer gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "Small town, Mr. Stanley. People have their ways." Lucas studied him, searching for any sign of deception or hidden meaning, but the officer's expression remained impassive. Finally, the man nodded, closed his clipboard, and gestured toward the road. "Have a good day." Just like that, the conversation was over. Lucas watched as they pulled away, their car disappearing down the street, as if nothing had happened at all. His jaw tightened as he exhaled slowly, forcing himself to process what had just happened. The police weren't going to do anything. Whether it was laziness, corruption, or something else entirely, they had already decided that this wasn't worth investigating. That left him with two options: either let it go and fall in line with whatever twisted rules govern this place, or figure out what the hell was really going on. His instincts told him there was more to this than just Karen's obsession with order. The way the neighbors had watched him leave, the unnatural stillness of the street, the way the police had acted like this was nothing out of the ordinary. None of it sat right. If they had been truly concerned about an outsider stirring up trouble, they would have at least put in the effort to make it look like they were taking it seriously. But they hadn't. They hadn't even pretended to care. He took another steadying breath before heading inside, locking the door behind him with more force than necessary. If they thought he was just going to roll over and accept this, they were dead wrong. He wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated. And he sure as hell wasn't about to let himself become another name on whatever quiet, unspoken list this town seemed to have for people who didn't fall in line. Lucas knew he couldn't let this go, but he also knew that acting recklessly would only make things worse. The way the police had dismissed him wasn't just laziness, it was something deeper. They hadn't even gone through the motions of pretending to investigate. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was that they already knew. That realization settled in his gut like a cold weight. He wasn't dealing with some random small-town eccentricity. This was something organized, something deliberate, and that meant every move he made had to be calculated. He had spent years learning how to assess threats, how to recognize when he was being cornered, and all his instincts were screaming at him that this was exactly that: a slow, patient maneuver to push him into a position where he had no options left. He spent the next few days keeping his head down, watching, listening. The neighbors weren't subtle about their surveillance. Whenever he stepped outside, there was always someone nearby watering their lawn, taking out the trash, pretending to check their mail. It was never the same person twice, and that was what disturbed him the most. This wasn't just Karen's vendetta. This was coordinated. Every time he caught someone watching, they held his gaze just long enough to make it clear that they weren't embarrassed about being caught. They wanted him to know that he was being monitored. He played along, pretending not to notice, pretending to settle into the quiet routine of suburban life. He mowed his lawn, nodded politely to passing cars, even went for evening walks as if he hadn't just had his tire shot out days before. And the more he acted like he was integrating, the more they eased up. The surveillance became less overt. The stares lingered for a few seconds less. The tension in the air didn't disappear, but it shifted into something more passive, as if they were waiting to see what he would do next. That was exactly what he needed. On the 5th night after the shooting, he made his move. The neighborhood was always eerily quiet after sunset. Most houses went dark early, blinds drawn, doors locked. It was almost unnatural, the way people seemed to disappear inside, as if the entire community followed some unspoken curfew. He used that to his advantage. Dressed in dark clothing, he moved carefully through the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the street lamps. He wasn't stupid enough to go snooping around Karen's house. She was too obvious, too much of a distraction. Whatever was really happening here wasn't just about her. It was bigger. That was why he focused on the other houses instead, the ones owned by the people who had been watching him the most closely. He started with the house directly across from his own, the one belonging to an older man who had never spoken to him but had spent an unusual amount of time standing by his window whenever Lucas was outside. The house was dark, no sign of movement inside. Lucas moved quickly, staying low as he made his way to the side of the house, where a neatly stacked pile of discarded newspapers sat just outside the garage. He flipped through them, scanning the dates. They were all from the past 3 months, every single one missing a front page. That was odd. He took out his phone and snapped a quick picture before moving on. The next house was even stranger. The family that lived there, if they could even be called, that had never seemed entirely right. There were 2 adults, a man and a woman, but no one had ever actually seen them leave the house at the same time. They never had visitors, never seemed to interact with the other neighbors, yet somehow they were always aware of what was happening on the street. Lucas had caught the man staring at him more than once, always from behind the curtains, always just out of direct sight. He found something even more unsettling there. Behind their trash bins, partially hidden beneath a tarp, was a box filled with old photographs. He flipped through them, his stomach tightening as he recognized the faces. They were pictures of people, neighbors, former residents. Some of the faces were familiar, people he had seen in passing, but others were completely unfamiliar. Some of the photos were old, worn, edges curling from years of exposure, while others looked more recent. A few of them had red XS marked over the faces. Lucas didn't know what disturbed him more, the fact that these pictures existed at all, or the fact that he was in 2 of them. He put everything back exactly as he had found it and got out of there as quickly as possible. By the time he made it back to his house, his hands were shaking, his mind racing. He locked the doors, double-checking the windows before sitting at the kitchen table, forcing himself to process what he had just seen. This wasn't just a neighborhood with strange rules. It wasn't just Karen enforcing her own twisted sense of order. This was something else entirely, something organized and methodical. And he was already in too deep. The next morning, things escalated. It started with his mail. He had been expecting a package, just a simple online order, nothing important, but when he opened his mailbox, he found something else instead. A single envelope, no return address, his name typed neatly on the front. He opened it carefully, his breath catching when he saw what was inside. It was a printed message, short and to the point. Leave now. Final warning. Underneath it was a photograph of his house, taken from an angle that suggested whoever had taken it had been standing in his backyard. Lucas closed the envelope, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just a warning. This was proof that they weren't just watching him, they had access to his property. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. They wanted him gone, but they weren't forcing him out. Not yet. That meant they still needed him to leave on his own, which meant he had time. He needed to find out what had happened to the people in those photographs. The ones with the red XS. He spent the next few hours researching property records, looking up old addresses, digging through anything he could find about the neighborhood. It didn't take long to confirm his worst fear. Every single person marked in those photographs had either vanished or moved away under strange circumstances. Some had simply sold their homes and disappeared. Others had been reported missing, their cases quietly closed after a few months of inconclusive evidence. A few had been involved in accidents, car crashes, house fires, unexplained medical emergencies. Lucas leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen, his mind a storm of thoughts. He had thought he was being paranoid. He had thought this was just Karen being a controlling busybody. But now he knew the truth. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. And if he didn't figure out how to stop whatever was happening here, he was next. Lucas knew that whatever was happening in this neighborhood was far beyond just Karen and her obsessive need for control. He had tried to rationalize it. Tried to tell himself that he was just dealing with a particularly overbearing group of suburban busybodies who had taken their community rules too seriously. But the things he had found, the photographs, The missing people. The fact that someone had shot his tire without hesitation proved that this was something much more organized, much more deliberate, and much more dangerous than he had originally thought. The worst part was that he didn't know exactly what he was dealing with yet. He had theories, but nothing concrete, no proof beyond the photographs and the way people acted when they looked at him. The way the police had dismissed his case so easily told him everything he needed to know about who he could and couldn't trust. If he was going to figure this out, he would have to do it carefully, methodically, and without drawing any more attention to himself than he already had. The next morning, he went about his routine as usual. He had no choice but to act as if nothing had changed. If they suspected that he knew more than he should, things would escalate even further. And the last thing he needed was for them to realize that he had found the photographs or that he was actively trying to uncover whatever had happened to the previous residents. He left for work at the same time as always, drove at the same speed, didn't glance too long at any of the houses, and forced himself not to react when he caught Karen watching him from her porch. The look in her eyes was different now, no longer the passive-aggressive condescension of a nosy neighbor, but something colder, more calculating. She wasn't just annoyed that he was breaking their rules. She was waiting for something. That thought sat with him all day, gnawing at the edges of his mind as he tried to focus on work. He forced himself through the motions, fixing up the cars at the shop, chatting with coworkers just enough to appear normal, but his thoughts kept drifting back to his house, to the feeling of being watched, to the knowledge that someone had been close enough to take a picture of his home from his own backyard. He knew that when he got back, he would need to check everything, every door, every window, every possible sign of forced entry. It didn't matter that he had locked up before leaving. If they wanted to get in, they would find a way. When he finally drove home, his suspicions were confirmed almost immediately. The first thing he noticed was that his mailbox was open, the lid left hanging at an awkward angle, as if someone had rummaged through it and hadn't bothered to close it properly. That alone wouldn't have been enough to put him on edge. Mailboxes got broken into all the time, but the second thing he noticed was far more disturbing. The back gate to his yard, which he knew for a fact he had locked, was slightly ajar. Not much, just a few inches, but enough for him to see that someone had been there. The padlock was still in place, but the latch was unhooked, and as he stepped out of his truck, he could see faint scuff marks on the ground where the dirt had been disturbed. Someone had walked through here. Lucas clenched his jaw, inhaling slowly through his nose to steady his nerves. He needed to check the house first. If someone had been inside, he needed to know before he started investigating anything else. He moved carefully, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he approached the front door. Nothing looked out of place at first glance, but as he inserted his key into the lock, he felt an unfamiliar resistance, just a fraction of a second longer than it should have taken for the mechanism to turn, like it had already been tampered with. His stomach tightened. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, listening. Silence. He moved through the house methodically, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. But everything was exactly as he had left it. No forced entry, no missing items, nothing obviously out of place. Yet he knew someone had been here. He could feel it in the air. The way the silence felt heavier than usual, the way his skin prickled with unease despite seeing nothing out of the ordinary. They had been inside, but they hadn't taken anything. That was somehow worse. His first instinct was to check his phone, to see if the security cameras had picked up anything, but the moment he tried to open the app, the screen flashed an error message. Unable to connect to server. His jaw clenched as he tried again, then again. The cameras weren't working. He moved to the router, checking the connections, but everything was as it should be. It wasn't a power issue. Someone had cut the feed. He exhaled sharply, his mind racing through his options. He still had the photographs. He still had the notes. They hadn't found those yet. If they had, things wouldn't be playing out this slowly. They were testing him, pushing to see what he would do next. That meant he had to stay ahead of them. He grabbed his phone and quickly typed out a message to someone he hadn't spoken to in a long time. Jack Delaney, an old friend who had spent years in private security and knew how to deal with situations exactly like this. You need a favor. Call when you can. Less than a minute later, his phone buzzed. He answered immediately. Jack's voice was sharp, alert. Didn't expect to hear from you. What's going on? Lucas kept his voice low. Something's wrong. I need to figure out who I'm dealing with. Tell me everything. Lucas summarized the past few weeks as quickly and efficiently as possible, leaving nothing out. The nail behind his tire, the shooting, the police's indifference, the envelope with the photo, the break-in, the missing pages from the newspapers. Jack didn't interrupt, didn't ask unnecessary questions. He just listened. When Lucas finished, there was a pause, then Jack exhaled slowly. This isn't just some territorial suburban bullshit. This is organized. The way they're handling you? It's methodical. Controlled. They're not trying to scare you off. Not yet. They're evaluating. Evaluating what? How much of a problem you are, Jack said. They don't know if you're a threat yet. That's why they haven't made a direct move. If they were sure you knew something you shouldn't, you wouldn't be talking to me right now. Lucas clenched his jaw. So what do I do? You need leverage. They already have control of the police, so you can't fight this the normal way. You need something that makes them hesitate. Find out who's really running things, what they're protecting, and make sure they know you have it before they decide you're not worth the trouble. Lucas nodded slowly, his mind already working through possibilities. Jack was right. He needed leverage. He needed something they couldn't ignore. And he knew exactly where to start looking. The house with the photographs. If he was going to find answers, that was where he would get them. And he had a feeling he wasn't going to like what he found. Lucas knew that if he was going to get answers, he had to move fast. He had spent enough time being watched, tested, pushed to see how he would react. He wasn't going to wait for them to make the next move. He was going to make it first. The house with the photographs had been on his mind ever since he found the box full of faces, some familiar, some gone. It was the only lead he had, the only tangible connection between the past and whatever was happening now. He didn't know who lived there, didn't know their names, but he had seen them watching him more than once, always from behind curtains, always just out of sight. It was time to change that. It was just past midnight when he left his house, moving carefully, staying close to the shadows. The neighborhood was quiet, unnaturally so. Even at this hour, there should have been something: distant traffic, the hum of a television left on in a nearby home, the occasional bark of a restless dog. But here there was nothing, just silence, thick and pressing, like the entire street was holding its breath. He stayed low, moving along the side of the road, his footsteps barely making a sound as he approached the house. The curtains were drawn, the lights off. From the outside it looked as lifeless as the others, but Lucas knew better. He reached the backyard, pausing near the fence, listening. No movement, no signs of anyone awake. He climbed over carefully, landing in the grass without a sound. The back door was locked, but that didn't surprise him. He didn't plan on going in that way. Instead, he moved toward the side of the house, where a small basement window sat just above ground level. It was old, the frame slightly warped, and when he pressed against it, it shifted just enough to tell him what he needed to know. He worked quickly, prying it open just enough to slip through. He landed softly, crouching in the dark, waiting for any sign that he had been heard. Nothing. He pulled out his phone, using the dim glow of the screen to get his bearings. The basement was cluttered, filled with old furniture, boxes stacked against the walls. He moved carefully, scanning the room for anything useful, any sign of what this house really was. Then he saw a filing cabinet against the far wall, slightly ajar. He reached it in 3 strides, pulling the top drawer open, rifling through the folders inside. Names, addresses, photographs. Some of them matched the ones he had already seen, others were new. Handwritten notes filled the margins, details about each person when they had moved in, when they had left, whether they had been dealt with. His stomach twisted as he read. Some of them had simply left, pressured out until they had no choice but to sell. Others had disappeared, their exits explained away with vague mentions of accidents or personal struggles. But the ones marked with a red X, those were different. The notes next to their names were short, final. Resolved. No further action needed. Cleared. He turned to the next folder and felt his pulse stutter. His name was there. Lucas Stanley. Moved in recently. Uncooperative. Refuses to comply. And then, at the bottom, in bold letters, decision pending. A floorboard creaked above him. Lucas snapped the folder shut, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't alone. He killed the light on his phone, sinking deeper into the shadows, listening. The movement was slow, deliberate. Someone was upstairs, moving toward the basement door. They weren't in a hurry. They weren't panicked. They already knew he was here. He had two choices: try to escape the way he came or stay and see what happened next. He clenched his jaw, muscles tensing. If he ran now, he would only confirm that he was exactly what they thought: someone afraid, someone who could be pushed out, someone who didn't belong. But if he stayed... The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. Lucas exhaled slowly, silently, every muscle in his body locked in place. Then the door creaked open, and for the first time he saw him, the man who had been watching from behind the curtains, the man who had never spoken, never acknowledged him directly. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, dressed in a simple sweater and slacks, the kind of outfit that would make him blend in anywhere. His face was calm, expression unreadable as he descended the steps, one slow footfall at a time. He wasn't carrying a weapon, wasn't moving with any sense of urgency. He knew Lucas wasn't going anywhere. Lucas didn't move, didn't speak. He let the silence stretch between them, waiting. The man reached the bottom step, stopping just a few feet away. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, measured. "You weren't supposed to see that." Lucas stayed still. "I wasn't supposed to see a lot of things." A faint smile. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Lucas's fingers curled into fists. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much to tell him. "I'm the one who keeps things in order." "The what you call it?" Lucas asked, his voice steady. "The people who left, the ones who never made it out." The man sighed, almost as if he was disappointed. "You think you've uncovered some great conspiracy, but the truth is much simpler. This place survives because it stays the way it is. People who don't belong, people who disrupt the balance, they either learn or they leave." Lucas narrowed his eyes. "And the ones who don't get the choice." The man didn't answer. He didn't have to. A beat of silence passed between them. Lucas could hear his own heartbeat, steady, controlled. If the man was expecting him to break, to panic, he was going to be disappointed. Finally, the man sighed again. "You have one last chance. Pack your things. Be gone by the end of the week." After that, he spread his hands slightly, as if to say, "It's out of my hands." Lucas stared at him, then at the files stacked neatly in the cabinet, but at the quiet efficiency with which they had been documenting every single person who had lived here before him. He could walk away. He could pack his bags, leave this place behind, pretend none of this had ever happened. Or he could finish this. The man watched him carefully, reading the decision forming behind his eyes. His expression darkened slightly, just enough to betray a flicker of something beneath the surface, something colder, something more dangerous. Lucas smiled. "We'll see." The man's lips pressed into a thin line. He stepped back, his message delivered, and Lucas knew what would happen next. The real test was coming. They weren't going to wait for him to leave. They were going to make him disappear. Lucas knew the moment he walked out of that basement that he had started a countdown. The man in the sweater, the one who kept things in order, had made it clear that he had a choice. Leave quietly or disappear like the others. But Lucas wasn't going anywhere. Not yet, not until he finished this. By the time he got back to his house, the neighborhood was awake, but the usual rhythm of morning routines felt artificial. People were moving as if on cue, stepping out to grab their newspapers, sipping coffee on their porches, watering plants that didn't need watering. He recognized it for what it was: surveillance. Every set of eyes on him, gauging his next move, waiting to see if he had gotten the message. He didn't react. He walked up his driveway, unlocked the door, and stepped inside like nothing had happened. He locked it behind him, took a breath, and got to work. The first thing he did was take every important document he had, his ID, passport, bank records, and stuff them into a backpack. If they were planning to cut him off, erase him the way they had erased others, he wasn't going to make it easy. Then he retrieved the files he had taken from the basement. He spread them out on the table, scanning them one last time, memorizing every name, every address, every red X. He wasn't just holding evidence, he was holding proof of a pattern, proof that what was happening in this place wasn't paranoia, but a system designed to quietly remove people who didn't fit. But proof meant nothing if no one ever saw it. He powered on his laptop and started copying everything. He sent it to multiple cloud drives, emailed it to himself, even printed hard copies just in case. Then he drafted a message to Jack. No explanations, no unnecessary details, just a single line: "If you don't hear from me in 24 hours, release everything." He attached the files and hit send. The moment he did, a weight lifted off his shoulders. Whatever happened next, at least the truth wouldn't die with him. The next few hours were a waiting game. He didn't leave the house, didn't check the windows, didn't make any calls. He just sat and listened. He knew they were planning something. He didn't know when or how, but he knew. It happened just after midnight. The sound of footsteps on gravel, the slight creak of the gate, the shadows moving just beyond the porch light. He had expected them to send 1 or 2 people, but when he checked the security feed, now rerouted through a separate network they couldn't disable, he counted at least 4. They weren't here to talk. Lucas moved quickly. He grabbed his keys, his bag, and slipped out the back before they could force their way in. He kept low, moving through the darkness, keeping to the blind spots of his own cameras. He knew his house better than they did. He knew the escape routes, the places where the fences were weakest, the gaps between the hedges that no one ever noticed. By the time they broke through the front door, he was already across the street, hidden in the shadows between houses. He heard them moving inside, searching, voices low and professional. Not amateurs, not hired muscle. People who had done this before. It didn't matter. He wasn't coming back. He moved quickly but carefully, making his way toward the only place that mattered now: the police station. Not the local precinct, not the ones who had dismissed him the first time. He had researched jurisdictions, found out which station operated outside this neighborhood's influence. It was a 30-minute drive, but he wasn't taking any chances. His truck was compromised. He needed another way. He made it 2 blocks before he spotted a car parked at the end of the street, unmarked, no lights, but definitely watching. They had thought of this. They were covering every exit. Fine. Lucas doubled back, slipping through a side yard, cutting through an alley that led toward a larger road. A convenience store sat at the corner, and he walked in casually, grabbing a soda from the fridge like he was just another late-night customer. Then he watched. A car passed. Then another. The same unmarked vehicle from before circled the block. They were looking for him. But they weren't looking for someone who had already blended in. The moment the coast was clear, he walked out, crossed the street, and flagged down a passing cab. He gave the driver an address 2 miles from the police station. If they were tracing his movements, he wasn't going to lead them directly there. 20 minutes later, he was walking up the steps of the station, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on him. He stepped inside, approached the desk, and placed the files down in front of the officer on duty. "I need to report a series of disappearances." By morning, the neighborhood was swarming with law enforcement. Not just local cops, the real ones. Unmarked federal vehicles, investigators in plain clothes, people who didn't answer to Karen or the man in the sweater. Lucas watched from a distance as they sealed off houses, escorted people out in handcuffs, retrieved boxes of documents. He saw Karen standing on her porch, her expression unreadable, her fingers gripping the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. For the first time, she didn't look in control. By noon, it was over. Lucas stood outside the police station, his phone buzzing with messages from Jack. "You did it. They're tearing it all apart. You're safe. Safe." He exhaled, the tension in his body finally loosening. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about stopping whatever had been happening in that neighborhood for years. And now it was done. He turned away from the station, stepping onto the sidewalk, blending into the crowd of people moving through the city. He didn't know where he was going next, but for the first time in weeks, it didn't matter, because he had won.